Good morning, everyone. I'm Lenny Bernstein. I'm a health and medicine reporter here at the Washington Post. I'm going to introduce to you today Todd and Dorie Burke. They're the parents of Thad Burke, who was one of the estimated 62,000 people who died of a drug overdose in 2016. And Alice Lee, the Washington Post video journalist who made that remarkable video that you just saw. Todd and Dorie, can you tell us a little bit about how Thad's addiction began, Thad's painkiller addiction began, and how it progressed?
Well, in January of 2015, he had an injury, broke his hand and foot, and we took him to the emergency room and everything, and he got prescribed painkillers. And we had no idea that he got addicted to painkillers. Now, in around October of 2015, his mom found Suboxone in his room. And of course, I was upset. I yelled at him. I said, "Dad, this is what inmates try to have sent into the prison system." And then that's when he told us about his addiction to painkillers. And I looked it up online, educated myself a little bit about it. And then I went back upstairs to the top of the steps and yelled over to Thad, told him, "Thad, I'm sorry, I love you."
He was on Suboxone in an attempt to beat his painkiller addiction.
Yeah. I said, "Dad, I love you. If anything ever happened to you, I wouldn't want to live." And then, of course, we had him in rehab two different times at Marworth. And the first time he went through rehab, he was doing real good, was real excited, wanted to get clean, wanted to be good, and was really good about going to meetings and everything. And but first time he went to rehab, he was able to get Vivitrol, the blocker.
It's a long-acting blocker.
But then it only lasts for like 30 days or so. And I called around to different places, couldn't find any place to subscribe him that. And I called a place in Milton, but they only prescribed patients that went through treatment at White Deer Treatment Center. So I wasn't able to get him the thing, and then eventually he relapsed.
Dorie, relapse is common. When Thad came out of rehab, were you hopeful? What did you think might happen?
Well, I thought this was just a bump in the road. Because he really wanted to get better, and he just, it was just totally out of our family, our realm of, like, this, I'm just gonna say it just doesn't happen to us.
And when he did relapse, what clues did you have? What did you see?
Just some behaviors that I just said, you're reminding me of when. And he's like, no, 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 no.
When he relapsed, was he back to using pain pills, or was he using street drugs, or what finally turned out to happen?
When he didn't have pain pills, or Suboxone, that's when he turned to heroin. Now, he relapsed, so we took him back again to Marworth. And then he didn't do as good when he came home as he did the first time. He wasn't as excited. He had drug court coming up and had all the anxiety and everything. And then, like about 3 days before he would have had drug court, I think drug court would have been real good for him, because it would have held him accountable, would have been structured. He would have had structure in his life. because he'd have to go to so many meetings, so many self groups, help groups, you know, and be held accountable. And but 3 days before he would have had drug court is when I woke up to my wife screaming in the morning, "Thad, wake up, Thad, wake up." And I went over, you know, as soon as that happened, it's like I knew what was going on in my head. You know, I jumped out of bed, I grabbed the phone, dialed 911, ran to my son's room. And he was not breathing, and he was blue, lying on the bed. And I had the phone in one hand, I grabbed him, dragged him to the floor, and started chest compressions. And then the emergency, you know, police and emergency personnel arrived, and, you know, my wife went and got Narcan before they arrived and applied that, and that didn't do anything.
That's the antidote that reverses an overdose.
Yes.
Didn't work.
No. And emergency personnel worked on him for 45 minutes while me and my wife sat downstairs in the kitchen. And then finally they came down and said that there was nothing more that they could do. So we had to sit there and wait on the coroner to pronounce our son dead. And then we went in another room while they were bringing his body down.
And what had he overdosed on?
Heroin.
Heroin. And do you know how he obtained it?
Not exactly.
Dorie, the grief group that well, can you tell us about the year since Thad has died? Sort of a ridiculous question, but what has the year been like for you?
Well, my sister-in-law shared with us about a group she went to years ago out in Indiana called Grief Share. And it just so happened that a local church had one that had started up. And it's like a 13-week thing. And we jumped in like about week 4. That was 11 days gone. And that was really helpful to go through I don't know if instruction's a good word, just to go through with other people, you know, through their grief and just talk about it. And it's a faith-based program, so that was a good fit for us. And you know, as we went along, I thought, okay, so I think we're doing okay here with our grief thing, doing things the right way. And then we went to an event in Williamsport, Saving Lives for Zachary, and met David Bauer, and he told us about a group that meets, and we've been going monthly there, and it's, you know, we cry together, we laugh together, but we all have, unfortunately, one thing in common.
Have you, in talking with all these folks, have you learned anything about grief, about moving on, about this particular way of losing a child? There's no way, I think, to describe losing a child, but in this epidemic, has it been helpful to meet with other families?
Yes. And one thing I learned right away was just that there's nothing that I could have done.
In the beginning, you're pretty guilty about the death, but they're telling you couldn't have.
Right. There's nothing I could do from May 21st, 1994 to October 2nd, 2016. Nothing I could have done to change. And that's hard as a mom.
Alice, you spent months on this video. Went up to Williamsport, met with all these folks. You attended the grief group. You have been with them at a 5K run walk afterwards. What was your ambition when you started, and what did you find out?
I think it was important, and this was something that we discussed early on, that we wanted to show the faces of the people who had really been impacted the most by this epidemic. It's easy to talk about numbers, it's easy to talk about the statistics, but to really get to the heart of who this is hurting the most, I think was something that we wanted to showcase. And so when we first went down to Williamsport and met with Tina, she had told us about this grief therapy group, and it sounded like a good place to meet more families who, as Dorie was saying, unfortunately shared the same thing in common, which was losing a loved one to this epidemic. And so when we first went to the grief therapy group, you know, it was in the backyard of the counselor's home. It was a beautiful evening, and it was just, yeah, it was heartbreaking hearing all of these stories and going to the 5K and 10K run and seeing how many people had been impacted in this community by this epidemic. And I'm actually curious too to hear, I mean, when you guys, because you guys were also at the 5K, 10K run, were you taken by surprise by how many people this had impacted and touched, or was this something that you were aware of even as your own son was going through this?
So last year was the first year that they did that 5K, 10K, and it happened to be probably about 3 weeks after Thad passed. And my sister, who lives in the Williamsport area, she said, hey, my friends want to start a team for Thad. So there were probably 30, like my nephews, their friends, you know, family. And I think last year, the first time ever, they had over 600 people at the 5K, 10K thing. And so this year, you know, I think it surpassed that. And yes, I was surprised because everybody has a story. Whether it affects them direct, like as it did us, or it's a nephew, a cousin, a friend, grandchild. So
It seems like there's no more than 1 degree of separation at this point in the epidemic. If you don't know someone who has died personally, then you have a neighbor or a cousin or a nephew or someone who knows someone who has died.
And,
you know.
and so many of the stories are the same about how it starts with painkillers. You know, I've heard so many stories like that, you know, that starts out with painkillers and it progresses to heroin or other substances.
Was his injury was a football injury, or I remember what?
No, it was an accident.
An accident. Yeah, and then the painkillers were prescribed at the hospital.
Yeah.
All right. Alice, were you surprised by anything you found in doing the work on this?
I think I was surprised by how many people were at the race, honestly. That did take me aback a little bit. I think especially when you're physically in that space and you're seeing everyone who's there and how many people have been impacted by it, it is kind of, and you know, Williamsport, for people who don't know, it's the home of Little League Baseball. So you go there and, you know, there are statues of little kids who are playing baseball. It is as American Pie as you can get. And so it is kind of this disconcerting environment to be in while you see all these families who have been impacted by this epidemic.
At the moment, there are 3 U.S. senators waiting to come out here and speak on the opioid epidemic. There are a whole bunch of folks here from the D.C. area who may be able, in their own corner of this world, to be able to do something. As parents of someone who passed, who overdosed on opioids, what do you want them to do? Not speaking as policymakers or anything. What needs to be done to bend the curve on the opioid epidemic?
Well, as people have seen from the 60 Minutes episode that one bill needs to change. And for the life of me, I can't understand why attorneys for the DEA switch sides. You know, and it's unethical, it's immoral. You know, for them to switch sides to be attorneys for the DEA and then be attorneys for the big drug companies. You know, that's just something I can't understand.
And you're in the law enforcement world yourself.
Yes. And when I was first told about it a couple months ago, you know, I thought, well, I'm against anything. You know, I work at a federal prison. I'm against anything that ties the hands of another federal law enforcement agency to effectively do their job.
How about treatment? Was it difficult, Dorie, for Thad to get treatment? We've already pointed out that it wasn't the most effective, although relapse is such a difficult subject.
Right. Our daughter researched, because we were like so naive, we didn't know how to do anything. You just go like, okay, find them a place to go, and we're like, okay. But our daughter is quite the researcher, and she found Marworth, and you know, Thad loved to lift weights, and he was at the gym every day, and she said, Mom, I found one that has a little gym, you know, and so everything just fell into place, and you know, it wasn't terribly far from our home, and so we're just, you know, wish the end results would have been better.
Was there a reason? Do you have any reason why you think Thad relapsed twice?
Now I think maybe the anxiety of his upcoming just drug court, maybe being nervous about what if I fail, because he had friends that he met, you know, through meetings and things that, you know, were going through it, or maybe had not done well and failed, and he didn't want to go back to jail.
And Todd, I see you actually have a tattoo of Thad. Do you mind showing that?
Yeah, this is a portrait I had done of my son, I think in December. And then this was the first tattoo that he had. This is the crest for Bern, Switzerland. That's where my great-grandfather came from. And then this I had done in June 28th, I think. And he had this on his back. So I wanted this arm to represent my son. So, you know, my son's always with me in my heart, and he's here on my arm, and he's here. His ashes, some of his ashes are in here. This is what we take when we travel places so that our son's always with us. Sometimes we take this if we're going to somewhere to spread his ashes, like at his grandparents' house, different places in Pennsylvania, and out in Indiana at the lakes where he liked to go. But when he passed, there was like about a little bit left in here, so I dumped that out and I put some of his ashes inside of it. It's a pre-workout drink.
And he didn't like to travel so much, so it's kind of one of those, gotcha. At least for me.
That's all the time we have for this session. Todd and Dorie, I really want to thank you so much for coming down and speaking. Your story is heartbreaking and hopefully effective in the war on opioids. And Alice, the video obviously speaks for itself. So I'm going to turn this over to my colleague, Mike DeBonis. He's going to ask questions in the next panel. And thank you all very much for listening.